So I'm obsessing just a little bit over the question of whether or not two groups who equally and firmly believe they're doing the right thing, because they are doing the right thing given their context, can coexist or are doomed to wipe each other out. In the West, we find it all too easy to villainize or exalt entire groups of people. Israel is good, Hamas is bad. Taiwan is good, China's evil. That naive and really racist thinking is because we are all cultural relativists. But most of us don't recognize the tendency. What is cultural relativism? Well, imagine a mountain with two climbers on opposite sides. One climber sees a lush forest, while the other sees a rocky desert. Both describe their experiences accurately, but their perspectives are shaped by their unique paths up the mountain. Those who understand cultural relativism tend to use it to excuse the bad behavior of a culture they like, while demonizing a different culture for doing the exact same thing, which is as silly as demonizing the desert or the forest. How is it what Israel is doing in the Middle East is different from what Russia's doing in Ukraine? The actions are equally inhumane and heinous, yet, because Israel's a US ally, they're allowed to run roughshod over the area, while Russia's called the evil empire. Cultural relativism doesn't always have adverse effects, though, and it's crucial for us to see cultural relativism, not to excuse atrocities, but to better understand the people who think differently from us, and there are a lot of them. Cultural relativism is the notion that a culture should be understood on its own terms, not using the standards of another culture. Our ignorance of relativism, or even a modicum of respect for different cultures, drives most of our global conflicts. This is true of the wars in the Middle East and Ukraine, where opposing ideologies supported by religious nationalism are violently proving true what American philosopher William James called the will to believe. William James was a brilliant and very famous 19th century philosopher and psychologist. He literally wrote the 1,200-page book that I think is still the foundation of functional psychology. He's also one of the founders of pragmatism, which considers the practical use of philosophical thought, although it's, like everything, somewhat more nuanced than that. In 1896, James delivered a very famous lecture called The Will to Believe, which defended the adoption of a belief without any evidence of its truth. Now, he was talking specifically about religion and faith, but the lecture is also one of the first to acknowledge that people will essentially believe whatever they want to believe, facts be damned. James wrote, "The reasons why we call things true is the reason why they are true." Acknowledging that truth is relative makes our relationships a little easier and also a lot more difficult because it requires us to recognize that our way is no better or worse than anyone else's way, even though we may think so, and even if our way provides arguably more comfort and security than another way. I think my way is more comfortable and secure, but that is my truth, and it is not my responsibility, and it is most assuredly not my right to make it yours. To a certain extent, every individual has a different way of being in the world. When we form civilizations and nation states, those too have the character of the people sustaining them. And we have a lot of characters on this planet, folks. We don't have to like a particular character, and we don't have to accept another way of being for ourselves, but we must acknowledge different ways exist and learn to coexist, or we're just going to forever be at each other's throats. Few facts are objectively true. Gravity, the necessity of oxygen for breathing. I think the general laws of physics are the only objective truths I can think of, and they may only apply to our reality, so I suppose those are even subjectively objective. I think we can agree, though, that the planet is polarized, and the problem stems from thinking that our moral, economic, or political system is the only good one, and then trying to force it on everybody else. Colonization is the epitome of such thinking. The Chinese documented their first encounters with Marco Polo and were astonished at his hubris. By the time the Brits arrived, China was already an ancient civilization with worldwide political influence. My way or the highway is a very painful way to live because it fails to recognize that every culture and every person is a universe unto themselves. You and I can both be right within our particular context. Recognizing that we often live within radically different frameworks can positively affect our relationships and help dissipate the polarization. For thousands of years, we've trounced around the globe trying to convince others that our reality must also be theirs, that our religion, morals, and politics are superior when they are merely different. Our way is not better. Nobody's way is better, an entirely subjective descriptor. We are simply different, and so have discovered multiple ways to do things like government. We recognize how magnificently, amazingly, wonderfully different we are once we stop trying to change each other, when we begin to stop colonizing and instead hang out to break bread instead of treaties. It is possible for opposing ideas to be simultaneously correct and for people to work through their differences and coexist without devolving into homogeneous, meaningless mush. But doing so requires a healthy dose of moral and cultural relativism for which few humans really have the stomach. Cultural relativism is not easy because it sort of forces us not to interfere. And relativism becomes more complicated when we throw religion in the mix, with its too often entrenched ideas about morality and gender, ideas most of the postmodern world has already appropriately rejected. Most religious people don't like to talk about cultural relativism because it means that they can't feel superior and proselytize and cajole or force people to convert to whatever religion they mistakenly think is true. I was on a trip with a bunch of theologians once, which I both highly recommend and highly don't recommend. But anyway, we were arguing about something, and I was trying to speak against how the Bible seems to extol cultural exceptionalism, which it does. And one of my colleagues said, now, you don't want to be a cultural relativist, do you? To which I responded, yes, I do want to be a cultural relativist, and so should you. Interestingly, like me, anyone on that trip who'd grown up with Star Trek was somewhat of a cultural relativist, whereas anybody older, not so much. Now, I readily admit that I have very specific ideas about the way the world should operate. Ideas shaped by a lifetime of studying religion and politics and physics and philosophy and economics and, a lot of Star Trek. It's all led me to understand that the communal and equitable sharing of all of the planet's resources, including our ideas, lifts all of us to a better way of being, to a better life. I also know that not everyone shares my outlook, and that's fine. People argue with me all the time, and they should, because my ideas come from my particular universe, a context that's shared by very few others. We don't need to convince anyone that we're right and they're wrong, not only because thinking that way is arrogant, self-centered, and racist, but also because it's simply impossible. The opposition, who might have a valid reason for being the opposition, will not listen, practically speaking. Well, they might listen, but they cannot comprehend because, again, they are in a different reality with entirely different rules. The philosopher Isaiah Berlin once remarked, "True knowledge is knowledge of why things are as they are, and not merely what they are." Berlin was born in Russia in 1909, 4 years after the first attempt to overthrow the Tsar. He witnessed the 1917 revolution, and in 1921 his family moved to Britain, where he was educated and would eventually become one of the contemporary world's most significant social and political theorists. Berlin had first-hand experience with dueling socio-political systems theory and wrote, "The notion of the perfect whole, the ultimate solution in which all good things coexist, seems not merely unobtainable, that's a truism, but conceptually incoherent. Some among the great goods cannot live together. That is a conceptual truth. We are doomed to choose, and every choice may entail an irreparable loss." we are all forced to make choices about our participation in society. Whether we like it or not, we are all cultural relativists. So, since we're already subconsciously doing it, let's try to be more aware of the tendency. Recognizing our way of life, our moral outlook, religion, politics, and economics are but one of many ways to organize, hopefully helps us avoid Marco Polo's arrogant error. And while we might not be able to make friends with people who think and act too differently from us, we can at least acknowledge our tendency to judge negatively people who think and act differently. That small act of realization will help us understand our innate tendency to think our way is always better than anyone else's, and perhaps allow us to start letting it go. Amen. Our question to consider today is, how does cultural relativism show up in your life? How are you handling all this? How does cultural relativism present itself in your life, and how do you deal with it? Let's go into small groups for a few moments to discuss together, and then we'll get back together in the big room here to share what we've thought. Enjoy your conversations, my friends. I'll see you in about 9 minutes.